be semi-organized here. So my name is Terry Bristol. I'm the president of the Institute for Science, Engineering, and Public Policy, and it's the institute that organizes this, the 2009-2010 Linus Pauling Memorial Lectures. And my I have a couple of things. One is to turn off your cell phones. Everybody double check. Check. You know, I actually got a phone call up here one time when I was doing that. So it was really bad. Sorry, I'm on stage. Okay, so we got all that. So I want to first of all just say thank you to the co-sponsors who've made all this possible. Again, our primary number one thank you corporate co-sponsor for a number of years now is Mentor Graphics Corporation. Thank you very much to them. Also supportive at Oregon Episcopal School. Hey, they're here, good. FEI Company, Portland, good, applaud them all. Portland State University, University of Oregon, keep going. Western Oregon University, Portland Community College, University of Portland, Clark College in Vancouver, Onami, so our nanotech people, FLIR Systems. All right, FLIRs are, Pacific University, Reed College, and the Oregonian. All right, thank you to all those guys for this whole season. Very nice. And also, for all that support, there's one special thing. Besides Mentor Graphics Corporation, Mentor Graphics Foundation, you gotta love these guys. Foundation gave us a grant that subsidized tickets for K-12 students and teachers. So all these cool students. Dr. Greenfield was actually we had her out at Sunset High School in Beaverton earlier today. This is her second talk for the day, and had a talk with a couple hundred students out there. It was really great, getting them to start thinking about basically who they're going to be and the things that are happening to them. And it was an extremely successful talk and a lot of good Q&A from those students, so that was really exciting. Okay, there's a couple of inserts. One, the artist, so in case yay, and in case you guys want to buy some of her art, that's good. She's in the cover of the deal. Also, a special thing, the guys at Portland State asked me to insert a little card in there. Sean Carroll, who's prominent evolutionary biologist, there's going to be a conference here, the date's on it, I don't have it in front of me. And that's kind of free talk over at the convention center, and Sean Carroll's a big deal, and it's a conference, Evolution 2010 or something like that. So that's just for all you guys who happen to be here, that's a freebie because no one else is going to know about that hardly. Well, maybe a few people will, but so that should be a good presentation, and you're all invited. And then there's a question card in there, and particularly if you have a question, Susan will take the normal talks, for those of you who are not normal, 3 microphones. But also if you want to write a question on the card, we will maybe do a couple of those here, and then we're going to hope to maybe if you put your email on there, that she'll respond to it that way. And any of you who are thinking about next season, which would be good, I think Brian Green's coming in, so he's got a new book. So those of you who love Brian Green. It's real quick. Of course, I can't remember his name now, but the guy who's the editor of Science News, Siegfried, I can't remember his first name, talking about statistics and dice and all that sort of stuff, fun stuff. Top astronomy guy, Filipenko from Berkeley, really good. January is going to be Brian Green. February, I think, is this guy's the top Mayan which is brain dead here tonight. Wasn't thinking of saying this, but anyway, Michael Coe. And Michael Coe is he's 82 years old. He said he couldn't come in the fall because he's leading tours down to the Mayan civilization. So he's a top guy, though. He was one of the people involved in the deciphering the Mayan hieroglyphs, and he knows everything. So he's real fine to get him here. And then some people from LSE on philosophy of science, and then I don't know the last person. Anyway, but it's going to be a really good year next year, so you'll all want to put your email down so I don't have to try and find you other ways. Okay, so all that having been said, enough. So Susan Greenfield is a professor of synaptic pharmacology, that's good, at Oxford University, where she leads a multidisciplinary team investigating the physical basis of the mind and some of its many important implications for our understanding of human behavior, work, and society. Dr. Greenfield is also the director of the Institute for the Future of the Mind, one of 10 research institutes in the James Martin 21st Century School at University of Oxford, with the aim of finding solutions to the biggest problems facing humanity and identifying the key opportunities of the 21st century. In addition to the primary research, the Institute has developed a network of influence in policy, education, and civil society, enabling wide impact and outreach. The Institute also acts as a hub, engaging politicians and other decision makers with the issues surrounding the use of technology and its interaction with the way people think. And I really want to say this is the way science and politics and everything should be organized. It's a model for where we're going in the 21st century, we hope. Professor Greenfield has won numerous awards for activities in the public engagement of science and has authored books for the general public, including Tomorrow's People, the acclaimed The Private Life of the Brain, unfortunately we don't have that one for sale, and The Human Brain, A Guided Tour, and Brain Story. Her most recent book, which is again for sale out there, is called ID, The Quest for Identity in the 21st Century. She spun out several successful enterprises from her university-based work on Alzheimer's disease, created radio and TV programs on science for the BBC and other broadcasters, and led a government Women in Science task force. She's received 28 honorary degrees, a CBE, and the Ordre National de Légion d'Honneur, and there's got to be something in France. In 2006, was installed as Chancellor of Heriot-Watt University. In January 2005, the John Templeton Foundation gave a $2 million research grant to Susan to form the Oxford Center for the Science of the Mind, which is dedicated to cutting-edge interdisciplinary work drawing on pharmacology, human anatomy, physiology, neuroscience, theology, and philosophy. I like all that philosophy background. She made the news as a thinker in residence in Adelaide, Australia in the summer of 2005 as a guest of the government of South Australia, which invites 2 or 3 world-class thinkers to Adelaide each year to live and work. Her residency permitted her to inform and influence the future of science through lectures, projects, media presentations. And in 2006, she was voted Honorary Australian of the Year. A couple of little anecdotes. So there's a magazine in Britain, which in UK, which is Harper's and Queen, I guess it's called. And they had the 50 most influential women. And Susan was number 14. And she mentioned that, notably, Dolly Parton was number 9. So it's like, so it's close anyway. Also, Dr. Susan Greenfield is Dr. Susan Greenfield. It's also Baroness Susan Greenfield. So how's she a Baroness? So you might think this was by inheritance or something like that. But it wasn't. No, she earned it. It's a recognition that, and she's become a member of the House of Lords, and it's through her accomplishments and her service to science in the UK. And I say she came from humble beginnings. She was mentioning her father was an electrician, her mother was a dancer, and now she's in the House of Lords, and it's Baroness Susan Greenfield. Please help me welcome.
Well, thank you very much, Terry, for that very generous introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here and to share with you some of the excitements. I ought to just say that when I was declared to be an Honorary Australian of the Year, it surprised me hugely. I don't know if anyone's ever been to Australia, but you might know it does feature the wine growing area, and this is relevant. And I was sitting at this table, and an Australian who's living in the UK got an award for being a very outstanding Australian, and then they said there was this other award, and they said, it's for people who show Australian values as well as contributing to Australia. And by that time, I was on the 2nd bottle of Shiraz. And to my horror, I don't know if this ever happened here, you hear your name called out and you realize you're going to have to speak. Standing up was bad enough, you know. And I remember saying at the time, is being able to give a speech on 2 bottles of Shiraz showing Australian values. And indeed it was. And we all sang Waltzing Matilda and everyone had a good time. Now, you might be relieved to know I have not been drinking Shiraz this evening because what we're going to be looking at is something that really does require us to focus and to think very carefully about where we're headed. And the fact there's so many people here, I think tells me that this is not just a question for scientists, this is a question for anyone here, not just who's a parent or a grandparent, but anyone who is a citizen of the 21st century, because really this is an issue we need to debate and discuss. And I think, as you've just heard Terry say, it's about time science came out of their ivory tower and shared with you, with everyone, the concerns, the hopes, the fears, so that we can all bring something to the party, we can all discuss it, we can all try and shape the kind of society that we think will be best. So what kind of society are we looking at? Is it the top right? I love this one. I love this picture because for me it summarizes how so many people view scientists, don't they? They think of us as dysfunctional nerds, hell-bent on world domination, yeah, devoid of any humanity, any softness, any emotion, all the things that make people so special. And there we are, and grinning in this robotic way. Yeah. Or is it bottom left? No identity, nothing, just a blur, just a passive recipient of the world as it floods in on you. Or fundamentalism, just someone mindlessly reaching out without really questioning things. Which of these options awaits us, or is there another option? That's what we're going to look at. Well, let me start, because if you ask a neuroscientist to come and talk, I'm afraid this is where we do start, with the brain. And I think for those of you, and I suspect most, who are not, don't tell me you're all expert neurologists here, are you? This hasn't been some horrible trick played by the organizers, and I'm about to tell you. So let me just check, and don't even put your hand up unless you are all expert neurologists, but let me assume you're not, and that there may be one or two, but not everyone. Let me share with you why I actually got interested in the brain in the first place, and this picture says it all. There we were in Oxford in the anatomy class, and it was the time had come, for a dissection of the human brain, and they wheel out these trolleys with Tupperware buckets, and you have to put on surgical gloves because the brains are in the buckets, and they are in formalin, which is a very pungent and toxic fluid which preserves the brain so you can cut it up. And so I have these gloves on, and then you roll up your sleeve, yeah, and just put your hand in this bucket, and then you pull out and hold a brain just like that. Yeah? And I remember thinking when I was holding it, if I wasn't wearing gloves, say I got a bit under my fingernail. Yeah. When I said that to a school once, someone actually did, they were sick actually when I said that. So I hope that's not going to happen here. But imagine getting a bit under your finger. Would that be what somebody loved with? Would it be a memory? Would it be a hope? Can you have a hope under your fingernail? Yeah, just think about it. Because this stuff occupies the same universe as nasal hair or tooth enamel or saliva or earwax, all the other stuff in your head and neck, and yet, just think what it does. Well, I hope it's doing something for you now. I hope you haven't dozed off already. And it does something. It gives you a wonderful inner world that no one else can share. And one of the fascinations of having the privilege of holding the brain in a hand like that is to contemplate and reflect and to think about how it becomes this. How does it change into a unique individual? This is George Bernard Shaw. You may or may not be familiar with his writings. He was a famous Irish writer in the last century. The whole point being that, like with anyone who's creative, what he did was really just a pale echo of what must have been going on behind those piercing eyes. And one could ask, what's going on behind your eyes? And however close you are to the person sitting next to you, however much you love them, however articulate you are, however poetic, however musical, they cannot get inside your head and see the world firsthand as you see it, nor you they. And that is why, as you contemplate the brain, as you hold it, and you think those thoughts, it can drive you mad, actually. Or you become a neuroscientist, or some say that the one is a prerequisite for the other, I think, probably. But anyway, so this is the enormity of the task, and I think it's the most exciting question, obviously I'm biased, that we can ask, and it's one of the most important. And I think it's the first one we have to address this evening, which is what makes you so special? How come we've been around for 100,000 years and there has never been a brain like yours, ever? Nor will there ever be again. And I'm sure with so many people here, there must be at least one pair of clones, that's to say identical twins, and yet I'm sure you see yourselves as unique and special people as you are. So what is it about this sludgy thing that you can just easily get under your fingernail? What is it? Where does the magic come? How does the water get turned into wine? Where do you get your individuality from? Well, let's think about that a little bit. And I think this is the first thing we need to think about. What do we mean by a mind? What do we mean by individuality? Well, the most brilliant thing about being born a human being, as opposed to, say, a goldfish, is that you do have a unique and special repertoire of behavior. The way people judge you and assess you and evaluate you is by the way you've been behaving. Now, can you say that about a goldfish? Let's be honest, they don't have great personalities, do they? They don't have individuality as such. And if your children had a goldfish and the goldfish died while they were at school, being brutal, you could go off and get another goldfish. Perhaps there's a number of people laughing, perhaps this has been done already, perhaps it's a plot you use. Whereas you couldn't do that with cats or dogs, and they might want you to, but you certainly couldn't do it with their brothers or sisters. Yeah? Now this is because as we become more sophisticated, as we become more individual, we do so because of the ability of our brains to free ourselves up from the genetic dictates of instinct, such as the goldfish, through to learning. Now, we as a species do not run particularly fast, we don't see particularly well, we're not particularly strong compared to many others in the animal kingdom. But of course, what we do more brilliantly than any other species by a garden mile is we learn. And this is why we occupy more ecological niches than any other species on the planet. It is our ability to adapt to our environment, to learn, that makes us so special. So let's start to think then about this biology of being special, of being individual, indeed of having a mind. So this is what happened to you in the first 2 years of your life. Now the blobby bits, for the non-neurology consultants here, the blobby bits are the brain cells and the stringy bits are the connections. And I hope you can see that in the first 2 years of life, the growth of the brain is caused not by the proliferation of the blobby bits themselves, the brain cells or neurons, but rather by the proliferation of the connections between them. Now this means that even if you are a clone, an identical twin, you will have a unique pattern of brain cell connections. Because what I'm going to show you is that those connections are forged and strengthened or atrophied according to the experiences that you have every moment you're alive. This is what we neuroscientists call plasticity. It doesn't mean, of course, that the brain is plastic. It comes instead from the ancient Greek root plastikos, to be molded. And what we're going to see now is how this can happen. And this is with one wonderful experiment that, if we wanted to, would keep us talking, I think, all evening. This is a brilliant experiment involving 3 groups of adult human volunteers, none of whom could play the piano. And a word of advice, if ever you get to volunteer for such an experiment, try and not be in the control group. The control group just stared at a piano for 5 days. Okay. Their luckier counterparts, the second group, actually learnt 5-finger piano exercises. Remember, they'd never played the piano before. They learnt 5-finger piano exercises from scratch. And we're going to look at the brain scans over 5 days of what happened when we compared these 2 groups. However, there was a third group that the most surprising and astonishing and remarkable, and I'll leave them as a surprise. So let's look at those 3 groups. Look first at the controls, and you can see here over 5 days, the blobs haven't changed. The brain is literally unimpressed by this, by staring at a piano. However, the center panel now, you can see that those engaged in physical practice, even over 5 days, can you see the change in brain territory that's being used, even over 5 days? But the surprise group that I promised you, the third group here, look at them. These guys merely had to imagine they were playing the piano. And can you see that they're almost indistinguishable from those who physically were playing it? Now, this tells us many things and suggests many thoughts and interesting ideas. The first is that the actual contraction of the muscle, which is the only difference between the physical practice and the mental practice, is really irrelevant and secondary to the thought that preceded it. And the man who developed the commonly used therapy for Parkinson's nowadays, a man called Honokowitz in the last century, he said this marvelous thing. He said, thinking is movement confined to the brain. Thinking is movement confined to the brain. And you can see that that would hold here. We would see it as thinking is movement confined to the brain. The other thing is that it shows you can't really talk about physical versus mental, as people like to do. You know, often I get fed up going to parties and say I'm a scientist, and people go away to get you a drink and don't come back again, you know, because they're interested in the philosophy, in the kind of exotic and insubstantial and romantic things, the mental activities and so on. And if you sort of traffic in the squalor of the chemistry of the brain, as I do, then this is considered somehow more pedestrian and so on. But you can see that the one is related to the other. You can't really separate the two. The mental is the physical mental. We don't know how, of course, but that's a separate issue. The fact that everything you do, even as you're sitting here, you're not doing anything, very politely, apart from laughing at my bad jokes, you're just sitting there, but I hope you're still conscious, and just imagine that your brain, what is happening now, by merely thinking, you're changing your connections, you're a different person from when you first came in this theatre. Different person, and you'll be different again in a second. Because every moment you're alive, your brain is changing and turning. Now, what we can do is look at the effects of the environment on how things happen, and this is from experiments in my own lab with rats, and you can see here that when we did brain imaging of a certain part of the brain, the outer layer, and we compared two things. We compared so-called control groups, these were ordinary rats in lab cages, compared to an enriched environment. Now, enriched for a rat, as you might appreciate, is different from enrichment for a human. You know, you don't take a rat off to the Caribbean and wine and dine him or her and, you know, have an interesting discussion about consciousness and the brain and so on. Enrichment for a rat means being exposed to lots of little ladders and wheels and things to climb and explore and tubes and so on, because, as you'll all be aware, rats are highly exploratory creatures, which is why we don't have to worry about the rat population getting extinct any day soon, because they're very good at exploration. But you can see here that there's a difference in the brain in the environment, not just with piano playing or the like, but rather similar to the blobs you've just seen. You can do the same in an animal brain as well by exposing it to a stimulating environment. And here it is. So this is again from our own work, and you can see how happy the rats look, as much as a rat can look happy. They are exploring and alert and so on in this highly novel environment. Now let's look at a single brain cell from the standard group and the enriched group, because by doing this, and this is why we're talking about rats now, we can start to understand what's going on in the brain of the piano players. So let's have a look at a single brain cell. This is from the isolated group, animals kept in ordinary lab conditions, compared to these guys who are in the enriched group. Now, at first glance, there may not seem that much difference. They've both got the blobby bits, which are the main part of the cell. But I'd like you to just concentrate for a moment on the branches. And can you see the branches in the animals from the enriched environment are greater, they're more extensive than the sparser ones in the isolated brain cell. Now, why is this important and what's happened? Well, when you're interacting in a stimulating environment, whether it's playing a piano or indeed engaged in an enriched environment as a rat, then your brain cells are working harder, they're more active, just like when you exercise muscles in your body. Now, when you exercise muscles in your body, the way they are affected, the way they respond, is they become larger and stronger. Brain cells don't quite respond like that. When they are active and when they're made to work hard, they grow branches. Now, why would that be interesting or important or relevant? Well, what you need to know is that there's many, many other brain cells, all desperate and converging and wanting to make contact with this one brain cell. For each brain cell you have up to 100,000 connections converging one upon the other. So it follows the greater the surface area of a brain cell, the more connections it can make. So let's trace that through. A stimulating interactive environment makes brain cells work harder, in turn induces them to spread branches, in turn increases their surface area, in turn gives them the potential to make more connections. So you can see the link here from a stimulating external environment to something very physical going on in your brain, the ability to make more connections. And that's what was happening with the piano players and the image I just showed you that accounted for those big blobs. So let's think about what that means. Here you are. You're born, in the words of the great psychologist William James, into a booming, buzzing confusion. What else is there? You're a little baby. What else can you do? You just evaluate the world in terms of raw sensations. How fast, how bright, how cold, how sweet. But gradually what will happen as a little baby is if you constantly are presented with the same visual pattern time and time again, and if that same visual pattern is accompanied by a certain tone of voice, a certain smell, a certain texture, sooner or later you will shift from that sensory environment to what we call a cognitive one. Cognitive from the Latin cogito, I think. And a cognitive environment means that these blobs, these visual patterns, these smells, will be not just abstract assimilation of raw senses, it will be your mother. And your mother will mean something to you. The more she features in your life, let's hope she features a lot, like with the piano players, the more she features, the more you see her, the more you interact, the more connections will be formed that are personalized to you and to her. And that is why she may be a generic lady to other people. She will be your mother to you. She will mean a lot to you. Every time you see her, all those connections will contribute to a significance that only you have for her. So the reason that I've shown this picture is to demonstrate just that. I would be very surprised if, other than me, who I hope you still recognize in the middle, these other 6 men meant anything to you at all. I imagine you see them as 6 generic white middle-aged men in suits and ties. They happen to be my colleagues in England, and they mean a lot to me. I could tell you their birthdays, I could tell you how many kids they have, I could tell you what they want to do with their lives, I could tell you bad things that have happened and good things that have happened. There's a whole host of connections and memories and thoughts that swirl around these people. You see them as generic men, and you could substitute in to me, nearest and dearest and colleagues and kids, that I would see just as that, men, women, children, so on. To you, they will mean a lot. They will have a cognitive importance to you because of the connections of your brain, because of the plasticity of your brain. Now, sadly, as you're personalizing your brain, it can go into reverse. And I'd like to stress that this is not a natural consequence of aging, but it is a disease of older people, and I'm talking, of course, about dementia, about Alzheimer's disease. With Alzheimer's disease, and with so many people here, I imagine there must be at least 1 or 2 people whose lives have been touched by this catastrophic condition, in caring for someone you may love. The things go into reverse, and just as when you're a small child, gradually you start to see the world in terms of other things. When you're a small child, these raw sensations, this one-way street, gradually becomes a two-way street because you start to evaluate what's coming in terms of what you've experienced already, and what you're experiencing modifies those connections. So every time you see your mother, there's a slight modification, but you're in this cognitive state. Now imagine if those connections now are slowly dismantled, then gradually the world will mean less and less. You will feel you don't understand things because you can't see one thing in terms of something else, and for me, that's what understanding is. So gradually, the world will dismantle. You will feel perhaps disorientated and confused because you can't understand what's happening. Like a small child is often confused and frightened, whereas a grown-up, of course, can understand everything that is happening. And here you can see it. Here in this charming Swedish lithograph, you can see the ages of man, or indeed of women, and that's reflected in the brain cell branches, the connections. And here you see, bottom right, the embryo, the fetus, and the early postnatal brain cell, as we've seen, characterized by the growth of the branches, reaching maturity with these fabulous big branches, enabling it to make connections, see one thing in terms of something else. But in the case of senescence or senility, sadly a dismantling, a retracing back to childhood. It's what I work on. I'm happy to discuss our work and some ideas if you wish to raise that in the Q&A, but this is a general talk, not a technical one. So we'll think in a happier mode about other ways in which people might temporarily abandon their minds. We talk about blowing our minds, having a sensational time. How many people, I wonder, would volunteer if I said now, right, let's go out now and have a cognitive time? Hands up, what's a cognitive time? Yeah, well, perhaps you all do, that's why you're here. You're here for a cognitive time. But that this is a Greek vase showing Euripides' Bacchae, where in that particular play, you may or may not be familiar with it, there was this rather stuffy old king called Pentheus, who wanted to put a stop to all the Dionysian, the god of wine, the revels and the orgies that they were having. As you can see here, they're having a pretty good time. He wanted to put a stop to that, and the very clever prophet warned him. He said, be careful. There's 2 forces in man, the wine force and the bread force. You need both. And if you try and suppress one, you'll perish, and that's what happened, it being a Greek tragedy. But anyway, letting yourself go. We talk about that all the time, don't we? Letting yourself go. Here's some people letting themselves go. They've put themselves in an environment not where the wine or drugs have modified their brain connections, but where the world has less cognitive content. The premium, I imagine, I would never do this in a million years, but I imagine the appeal of it is to have the speed, the rush, the thrill, the physical sensations of the spray on your face, the wind on your face, the adrenaline rush. These people are not worried about their mortgage, I don't think, probably on this very moment. This one was from Australia, one of my favorite ones, where people have actually paid money here to let themselves be out of control. An interesting idea. Why should being out of control, look at the center guy, he doesn't look at all pleased. Why would being out of control be so appealing? And yet it is. People like to let themselves go. And for more sedate among you, fragonard swing. So you can see that these very different little examples nonetheless have something in common. I would suggest to you it's an abrogation of the sense of self. That is to say, temporarily this time, you put yourself in a world stripped of cognitive content, strongly dominating by raw sensations. We often pay money to do that. And we talk about blowing your mind, out of your mind, letting yourself go, and indeed having a sensational time. The very word ecstasy in Greek means to stand outside of yourself. So if that's the mind, or loss of it, then we can think about it in physiology terms. The more branches you have on brain cells, the more connections you can make, the more personalized the significance, and the more you can understand from a unique perspective. The more you see the world through your eyes in a way that is unique to you, that no one else can share. And the more you exercise your brain, as this intelligent person is doing his thinking, look how big and hunky he's got compared to these idiots who are doing physical exercise. Thinking, that's what neurons do. This is a neuron. Think of this man as a neuron. So here we are, living our lives, as some people say, this is downtown Oxford, this is what it looks like. So, and the reason I like this particular picture is that everyone is in their own little time and space trajectory. Everyone is living out, as you're living out, as I'm living out. We're all living out our life stories that are unique. One thing unfolds from another. We all have a past. We hope we have a future. We have a present. We have a special place in the universe that no one else has and no one else can copy or share. And every moment in your life, each of these people, everything that's happening is changing and configuring and shifting those patterns of connections to make you truly special. So I'd like to suggest to you that the biological basis of the mind is the personalization of the brain through the unique dynamic configurations of neuronal connections driven in turn by your unique experiences. Now, that's the neuroscience bit done so far. Now, is this a sunrise or a sunset? Given our brain is so sensitive to the environment, let's look and see whether for the first time in the 100,000 years we've been around, this very vulnerable and very impressionable human mind could be radically changed. And if it's going to be radically changed, is it good or is it bad? That's what we need to address. So I think there's various scenarios, and I'm going to call this scenario the someone scenario. And I imagine everyone has heard of David Beckham and his wife Posh. They lived lived quite near here for a while, for Galaxy, I think it was. Didn't do very well, I don't think. But anyway, they're great icons in the UK. And the reason I show them to you is that they are steeped in material well-being. They are handed up by some as being someone. People talk about being someones. Is this what we want to be in the future? Is this the kind of environment that we want to aspire to, where we own things, and that will give us an identity? How does that reflect in our physiology of our minds? Well, it all started with this man, a man called Bernays, who was actually the nephew of Freud. And he was really active in the 1920s. And what he did was he thought about identity, but more importantly, he thought about how to sell people things they didn't really need. He was, if you like, one of the modern fathers of advertising. And the reason on this particular picture it features this young woman smoking was that this was a very good example of something quite ingenious he perceived about people and about how they see themselves. What he had to do was to try and persuade young women to smoke, because at that time, no women smoked, and yet at the same time, it was perceived as a very good market for cigarette sales. Now, most of us would say, well, okay, well, let's just get a woman to say, here's a cigarette, it's nice, I'm enjoying this cigarette. Yeah? No. What he said was to show pictures of attractive young women smoking and say, the torch of freedom. His sneaky strategy wasn't to tell you it was nice or good, but rather that it would say something about you. By having a cigarette as a young woman in the 1920s, it would say something about you. It would say that you were liberated. It would say that you were free. So this notion that we do things, we use symbols to say things about us is quite an interesting one. And just for fun, and I'd invite you to do the same, it's quite interesting, I went onto Google and it's a phrase I'd heard once or twice in advertising, and I just put into the computer, as individual as you are. You can do the same. Now, if you do that, look what happens. You get that up, you get this up, you get this up, you get this up, you get this up, yeah? So what's very interesting is there's all these products that if you have them, you're going to be an individual. The problem is you then go to your neighbor's house for dinner. Guess what? They've got the same kitchen. So they're as individual as you are. Horror, horror. You have to have an arms race of individuality. Yeah? So having symbols and aspiring to symbols, as people seem to enjoy doing or want to do in our current society or in the late 20th century, doesn't seem to be doing it in terms of reflecting those exquisite brain cell connections we've just looked at, which are truly individual. That's the real you. These symbols don't seem to be successful. And this is a good book by someone called Oliver James, which I think you can certainly get it on Amazon, where he uses the metaphor of a virus to summarize the problem, he calls affluenza, of why people are more unhappy now than they were ever before, even though they have so much. It's because they are constantly dissatisfied, because they are attempting to express those brain cell connections in terms of objects, the kitchen, the bracelet, the fluffy toy, the trainers, whatever, and of course finding the neighbors do the same. And this leads to the biggest curse of the 21st century, which WHO says is going to be bigger than AIDS. 1 in 4 people will be suffering. Sadly, it's estimated from clinical depression. So clearly, as a society, and as we face the future, and as we talk about our individuality and how to express the fact that we are individual, and without doubt we are, then we could say that in the someone scenario, this consumerism, yes, there's a form of individuality, but you're never fulfilled. So therefore, it's not necessarily the ideal. What is another option? Well, I call this option the NE1 option. And as you can see, I've taken here 2 snapshots of 2 ideologies that really bedeviled the 20th century of fascism and Marxism, which have in common here the fact that the people have subsumed their identity under a collective narrative, repugnant as it is to most of us. Now, why would this be appealing, and what's going on in the brain for people to sacrifice their individuality, it seems, to be one of a great crowd? Well, there was a man called Paul MacLean who in the last century was fascinated by the Nuremberg rallies and why people behaved in this terrible way. Why did they en masse adopt such collective hatred? And his view was this, which he called the Triune Brain, is that the anatomy of the brain reflected evolution and comprised the most basic part, the reptilian brain, and then elaborated around it, like layers of an onion, was the brain that was comparable to that of mammals. And layered onto that, for even more sophisticated species, was the primate brain. And this is what he said was composed of. And he said what happened was that in situations like the Nuremberg rallies, what happened was that these outer layers, the more sophisticated layers, were suppressed, unleashing, as you can see here, aggression, this primitive reptilian brain. And that was why people behaved like that. Now, I reject that idea. First of all, the anatomy is overly simplistic, although I'm not blaming MacLean because he lived in the 1940s, so clearly we didn't know then as what we know now. But the notion that such mindless behavior was indeed mindless, I don't think is the case. And let me suggest to you another scenario. The issue there in the Nuremberg rallies and in the appeal of the NE1 scenario is not unbridled, unleashed, undirected emotion. It's a story. People at Nuremberg rallies knew the narrative. It was a collective narrative. It was definitely a narrative. It was, and this is still popular in certain ideologies today, a David and Goliath narrative, where you have the innocent, oppressed people who are right in the minority and the evil conspiracy, the big evil conspiracy oppressing them. And everyone buys into the David and Goliath, where the little guy who's right finally vanquishes the big evil oppressor. And that was the kind of story that I think people bought into. But it was a story nonetheless. It was a collective story. Now, in that case, people may have found fulfillment, such as it was, but they're no longer individuals. And we could say a lot more about ideologies and extreme fundamentalism and how that is still with us today and what might be happening in the brains in that way. Again, I park that for the questions. But the technologies and the ideas of the current century that fascinate me most in terms of scenarios is not the Someone scenario or the NE1 scenario. In a sense, they belong to the 20th century. It's this one that I think is going to be particularly dominant in our century. I call it ours. I was born in 1950, so I don't know, halfway through. But the nobody scenario, the scenario I said at the beginning of perhaps people becoming the most scary thing of all, which is nobody, losing an identity. And let me share with you my thoughts for that. I'm not the first person to raise the issue of the impact of technologies on people. You can see here Newsweek and Time. On the one hand, the child looks like he's about to be a master of the universe. On the right-hand side, the child looks like a victim. In any event, I think most people, every parent I meet actually, is concerned about the possible impact of screen technologies on their children. This is from the United Kingdom, and I'm sure in the US it must be similar. One estimate of what happens to a child between the age of 10 and 11. You can see here between the child's 10th and 11th birthday, 900 hours spent in class, just under 1,300 hours with their family, and look at this, just under 2,000 hours in front of a screen. Now, given, I hope I've persuaded you that your brain is sensitive to the environment, here you see the environment is changing in an unprecedented way, ergo, could our brains be changing in an unprecedented way? That's all I'm saying. I'm not saying whether they change for good or bad. If you Google on me, you'll find that I have a certain number of detractors who say, Baroness says computers rot the brain, and things like that. Nothing could be further from the truth, but what I do say is we will be selling our young people down the river if we don't debate this question, and we don't try and maximize the environment for them to give them the best possible start in their lives, rather than assume it will all shake down and all be okay and we can just be complacent. All I put before you is the chance or the opportunity or the request that we think and discuss it calmly and try and get the best out of the situation. For example, one of the good things, and this is another excellent book I'd recommend by a man called Stephen Johnson, there are some good things definitely related to screen technologies. And what he argues in this book is that it might account for the now acknowledged rise in IQ levels in many countries. And the reason, he says, is because when you do an IQ test, what you're rehearsing is the same kind of mental agility as when you are on a computer game, the same kind of speed of perception and pattern recognition and sequence matching and so on, are just the kind of skills that are required in IQs, and you have an end goal and an answer and so on. But then he also says, and I think this is very important, isn't it interesting there's been a rise in IQ levels across the board, but why aren't we therefore seeing a rise in symphony writing or novel writing or insights into the economic situation, or an increase in poems and literature, and an increase in scientific discoveries? We're not seeing that commensurate. So could it be that there are various mental abilities and skills, not one worse or better than the other, but just a portfolio of mental abilities? And for sure, the screen technology is enhancing and encouraging and rehearsing one, but that is not the whole story. What I'd like to think of is we can differentiate process from content. Process being the kind of skills you'll have in an IQ test, but content being understanding, seeing one thing in terms of something else. Now, another idea is multitasking, and some people think it's good to multitask. Clearly, this lady's employer might be very pleased that she's doing several things at once. She's on the phone writing, she's got computers up. Taken to the extreme, this could be an impact of multitasking. Now, would you want this? If it's supposed to be such a good, at least it's a padded loo seat, I suppose. That says that we have to be thankful for. It does make you think, I got this off the web, it makes you think it must be in development somewhere. They wouldn't have just done this, yeah. However, and this perhaps most parents know already, it's shown here in this experiment that people listen less when they multitask. Perhaps this comes as no surprise to parents. For those of you not familiar with the orientation of the brain, this is the back of the brain, this is the front, and similarly they're looking at each other, you're looking at them, and you can see these activated parts lighting up here with brain imaging techniques. And as you can see, when you listen and see at the same time, then the less areas are lighting up than when you do otherwise. So multitasking, we ought to think carefully about whether we want it or not. Another thing that I'm sure we don't want is this increase shown here, which I think is the same in the States. Methylphenidate you may not recognize as a name for a drug, but I'm sure you'll recognize the name Ritalin. Methylphenidate is the generic name for these drugs that are used for attention deficit disorder. And you can see here in the UK, and I think it's the same here, there's been a huge increase in prescriptions, trebling over the last 10 years. Now, this could be that doctors, physicians nowadays are more liberal in their prescription of the drug. It could be that nothing's changed, but we now name it in a way that we didn't name conditions 10 years ago. We now medicalize it. Or, this is not mutually exclusive, and as I just put to you as a question, could it be the environment has changed and is mandating now shorter attention spans? Let's have a think about that. Let's, if we're looking at shorter attention span and it's strongly sensory, by looking at this quick little clip of a movie. Now, do you feel exhausted from that? Imagine doing that 2,000 hours a year or 6 hours a day. What would that do to your brain connections? And all I say is, shouldn't someone fund some research to just explore whether there might be a relationship between the increase in ADHD and exposure to that kind of environment? That's my case rest. Next is lack of metaphor or abstract concepts. And why am I suddenly flagging this? Well, if you think about it, a computer screen is very literal. The images are very literal. But when you read a book, they're not. When you read a book, just think about it, unless it's a reference book, and unless you're cheating, usually the author, the authority, takes you by the hand, and you go on a journey. You go through beginning, to the middle, to the end. And you end up cognitively in a different place. Now, this may not be a journey you enjoyed, it may not be a journey you agree with, it may not be a journey that you want to repeat. Nonetheless, you've gone on a series of sequence of steps. Yes, it's fixed in its time. Yes, it's passive. But one thing has led from something else. And gradually, if you read another book, like we've seen, you can evaluate one in terms of the other, and then another in terms of another. So gradually, you will build up a conceptual framework that means that every time you read a book, you will be able to evaluate it, click it off against the checks and balances of your previous things that you've read. And for me, this is what education should be. It enables you to understand the world, to see one thing in terms of something else, to navigate the world and to evaluate the experiences you're having, not in sensory terms, but in cognitive terms, where you can allocate a meaning, a significance, a weight, if you like, to what is happening, because of the linearity of the words. Now, words themselves are marvelous because it is not necessarily simply an image or an object. Sometimes you come up against words like this, abstract words or concepts, that really defy a simple image. And that's why reading and using words means so much more than using pictures. For example, again, I Googled on honor, just for fun. I put in honor and went on to Google Images, and this is what I got. Honor. Remember, this is England, there's someone getting the award. Honor, honor, honor. Now, if you showed that to a Martian, would they understand what honor was, do you think? Yeah, whereas, think of honor, think of all the ways in which we use it, the cultural significance that it has for many different people in many different ways, the nuances of the word honor, and how strange it would be that it would be in any way anything to do with those pictures or shown by those pictures. Next, we think about content versus process, as I touched on with the IQ. I don't know how many people play computer games here, but let's say you play a computer game such as this to rescue the princess, the noble Princess Yokka. Let me be brutal. Do you really care about this princess? Do you care about her? Do you care about what she's going to do with her life? Do you care about what's happened to her? Do you care about her relationships? Do you care about what she's thinking? Do you care about what she's feeling? And yet, if you read Tolstoy, you do care about the princess. Yeah, because this is the difference for me between process on the left, perfectly good, agile, necessary, important, but let's not kid ourselves. It doesn't give you content. It doesn't give you understanding because you don't have that conceptual framework. You're not seeing one thing in terms of something else, so you're not understanding it. It doesn't mean anything to you, but when you read a book, of course the princess means something to you, otherwise you wouldn't be reading the book. You wouldn't care. You wouldn't bother reading the book if she didn't mean something. It's because she means something to you that you go on, and through her eyes, through the way you see her world, you start to get an empathy and an understanding for how other people view the world other than yourself. So let's think about empathy. These two children don't appear to be communicating with each other too much. They are indeed interactive, having a highly processed experience. And yet we know that communication is so important when it's in 3 dimensions. As you may be aware, the impact you have when you meet someone, only 10% really is the words. The most important thing is eye contact and body language. And when you think about it, eye contact can be very scary. It's horrible when you talk at someone and they don't look you in the eye. Imagine how spooky that feels. And even worse, when someone does look you in the eye, and they keep looking you in the eye, and they keep looking you in the eye, just remember how uncomfortable you feel. So eye contact is a very carefully rehearsed skill. Not too much, not too little. Body language, we pick up on that a lot, and it says a lot about us. Similarly, voice, tone of voice, rate of voice, volume, what we call prosody, 35% of the impact. Then, who knows what pheromones do? Pheromones, these sneaky chemicals that we can smell subconsciously that will have an effect on how we feel about someone. And finally, of course, physical contact. Even in a business situation, you'll shake someone's hand. In a social situation, you hug someone and so on. None of these things are available on social networking. If someone does social networking, a lot of the time, they won't rehearse eye contact or body language or voice or pheromones or physical contact. And therefore, if you're not rehearsing it, it will get even harder than it normally is for most of us to talk to someone face to face, which means you'll avoid it because it's aversive, which means you'll be worse at it and there'll be a kind of vicious circle. So this empathy, this communication, I do worry about if we go from having 10 friends who you love and hug and see and go for walks with and talk with, compared to 900 friends. Someone once spoke to me that had 900 friends. Cyber friends, obviously, on the social networking site. And it just makes you wonder what a different world they live in. Some people live in Second Life, which is a way of, if you're fed up being, say, an accountant, you can go and be Vlad the Dragon Slayer for a while. And this can be fun, of course. I'm not saying it's a bad thing to do. But when it does, as it does for some people, take over your life so you have no first life. Second Life is a kind of Tom and Jerry world. It's a world where actions speak louder than anything else because, of course, it's actions that draw you to the screen. Screens that don't have much action on, that just have someone talking, aren't as exciting or as interesting as color of movement and action. And what's very interesting is people who have a problem with empathy anyway, autistic people, and you may be aware autistic spectrum is where you have difficulty in attributing separate thoughts and feelings independently to others. Such people are very comfortable on Second Life, and I'd like to suggest that maybe because the world of no body language, no pheromones, nothing you have to pick up on, where simply you're having cartoon-like actions, that means that you can adjust to that more easily than a world where there's these other things you have problems with. And so that when you go on to Second Life, you don't need these other things because they're not there. So I just wonder about reduction in empathy, whether that could also be related. And related to that is identity, because if you are not feeling what other people are feeling, if you're not aware of yourself as completely separate, how do you see yourself? One could actually look at the history of blogging to raise some worrying issues about identity. So here we are, 1999. I just have to tell someone about this thing my cat did today. 2004, oh my God, from Flickr, cat pictures. YouTube, 2005, moving cat pictures. And that pinnacle of civilization, Twitter, 2007. 1 p.m., my cat just sneezed. 1:02, cat sneezed again. 1:04, cat hasn't sneezed recently. Getting worried, yeah? Now, what does this say about someone? Does this not perhaps say that they're in some kind of existential crisis, possibly? You know how little children say, look at me, mummy, look at me. I'm doing this, mummy, look at me, I'm doing this. And the little things they do, the everyday banal things they do, that you have to notice it. You have to, because they don't have a robust enough construct of self to just for it to be self-contained. And I just wonder whether these folk, perhaps not everyone on Twitter, obviously we have our prime ministers and things going on Twitter, but many people who just read out a banal flood of consciousness, it does make me concerned. And I have to tell you a story about this, actually, which is quite funny, and you might wish to, it's very topical, so I haven't got a slide of it, but you may wish to look it up. Last week, I did an interview with The Times, a London, in a British newspaper, you know, I'm sure, and I was talking about this, and I said, what really concerns me is young people might be reduced to just saying yuck and wow and yuck and wow. And because I speak quickly, the journalists who've been taping this transcribed it mistakenly as one word, Yokka wow, Y-A-K-A-W-O-W. Yeah? And obviously I saw this and it didn't really matter at all, Yokka wow, yeah. But what had happened, within a few hours of this coming out, it went viral, and there were 75,000 hits on Google. There's now, if you look on this, a church of Yokka wow, where it says, welcome to the world of no consequences, Yokka wow, yeah. I think it's even made it onto Fox News or something here. And then I tried to get the domain registered, but someone's already got it, obviously, yeah. and on this Yokka wow, if you just Google it, you'll see, and on Yokka wow, they take up the point I make. You'll see there's a YouTube video where I've said, oh, who wants to care about someone saying, no, I'm putting one sock on, now I'm putting another sock on. There's some brave soul who says, look, I can put 2 socks on at once. And there's a video of a guy putting 2 socks on simultaneously. So it's an aside issue, but it does show you, actually, I do have a great respect now for the cyber world, the fact it can go so quickly to so many people, and how such things can capture the imagination. Or is it that it means something to people? Is it that it is important and people are thinking about it? So you heard it here first, Yokka. Now, another aspect of the screen technologies, as well as that, is something that's very relevant to all of us, especially with the financial crisis, and that's risk-taking. President Obama said that he thought the current financial crisis was due, in no small measure, to greed and recklessness. Now, recklessness and risk is a very fine line between what it is. All of us know that you can't be completely risk-averse, that you ventured, nothing gained. On the other hand, look where those young traders may have got us with their recklessness. Could we be seeing a change in risk-taking attitudes thanks to the screen? Now, let me take you through why I think that might be the case. If you are a neuroscientist and someone asks you about risk, the way you deal with that is to say, well, let's think of examples of when people have neurological damage, and that is characterized by excessive recklessness. And there was one such a case, the first, that happened in Vermont in 1860, was a man called Phineas Gage. And Phineas was the foreman on a railway gang, and it's his job to tamper down, to push down explosive with a big iron, a formidable object, some 4 feet in length. And that's what he was doing. Now, any story about explosive obviously has only one ending, and yes, this is what happened. The explosive went off prematurely, and it drove the iron through the frontal part of his head. Now, why am I telling you this story? Clearly, you're going to say the guy died. No, that wasn't the case, not so. And in fact, what was miraculous, seemingly, was that he actually came round after a minute or two and seemed unimpaired, despite the fact he had a great hole through his head. He could walk, he could talk, he could see, he could smell, all the senses were just fine. And indeed, in those heartless days of no security, he actually went back to work, despite the hole in his head. And it was only then, a few months later, that his colleagues noticed a great change. What had happened, I'm about to show you a gory picture. Anyone who's a bit queasy, you might close your eyes for a second. What had happened was that he was excessively reckless. This is the picture. You can see how severe the damage is. This is reconstruction. And it's remarkable that this frontal part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, does something so sophisticated that when damaged, it's only after a few weeks you see subtle changes such as this. So this is the prefrontal cortex, shown here in turquoise. In humans, it's 33% of your brain. In chimps, our nearest relatives, only 1% different DNA, it's only 17%, and in the humble cat, it's only 3%. So clearly, there's something very evolutionary new about the prefrontal cortex. It's something to do with risk-taking, possibly. It's a new area, and could this be in any way related to what we're asking and what we're discussing when we talk about risk and the screen? Well, let's have a think about that. I'd like to show you another film now of a modern-day Phineas Gage. This is a man called Michael. He's a Vietnam vet, and you're going to see a brief video now of what happened to Michael when he got shrapnel from Vietnam in his prefrontal cortex. Okay, let's roll that movie.
X-rays revealed that shrapnel from the grenade had penetrated the front of Michael's brain.
Michael has undergone a rather dramatic transformation. Before his injury, he was a bright and very promising and assertive soldier. And subsequent to his injury, Michael became unemployable, made many mistakes in social behaviors and relations, and has to live a much more limited life now.
Demoted and eventually discharged from the army, Michael has been unable to hold down a steady job. He's now working under supervision as a hospital janitor.
I'm going to start out by giving you 10 chips. Each chip is worth 5 cents.
Dr. Jordan Grafman is trying to establish why Michael's life has fallen apart. What aspects of his mental abilities have suffered because of the damage to his frontal lobe?
8, 9, 10.
This gambling task is designed to test his ability to weigh up the likely consequences of his actions. The point of the test is to see at what stage in the game he decides to stop.
Do you want to stop or do you want to continue?
Continue.
High cards, Mike wins a chip. 10 or less, and he loses one.
Continue.
The cards are deliberately arranged to give him a good winning streak,
Continue.
followed by a steady run of losses. Normally, people stop while they're ahead.
Continue. You should have kept it. Continue. Continue.
That's it. We're at the end. You gave me back all your chips.
Okay, so that's what we mean by recklessness, and that's how people can actually evaluate it scientifically. Now, the physician at the time, John Harlow, also documented Phineas as the following: childish, impatient of restraint, a child in his intellectual capacities. So if we're thinking about this prefrontal cortex and relating it to recklessness, can we also relate that to children? And what's very interesting about this area is it does indeed reflect evolution. I said in evolutionary terms it was a very late comer, and so it is in development. As you can see here, the mature prefrontal cortex really is only kicking in late teens, early 20 years of age, which is very, very late when you think. I'm sure there are many people here around 20 who would feel quite surprised that their brain wasn't fully on stream in terms of prefrontal cortex. So let's think about children and recklessness and the screen and obesity. What's very interesting is this study here showed that obese people are more reckless in gambling tasks, rather like we just saw with Michael. And similarly, people who are obese, who have a high body mass index, they have a lower activity in their prefrontal cortex. Do trust me, this is going to make sense in a minute. It is going to come together. Another group of people that have an underactive prefrontal cortex are schizophrenic people. Now, schizophrenia is not, contrary to popular imagination, it's not simply a split personality. No, it's not that. It's a split from reality. And what's very interesting is schizophrenics are very similar in many respects to small children. For example, they cannot see the world metaphorically. If you say to a schizophrenic patient, what does it mean? People who live in glass houses mustn't throw stones. If you say that to a schizophrenic person, and indeed to a child, both will say something like, well, if you live in a house and it's made of glass and someone throws a stone, the house will break. They will give you a literal interpretation, but that ability to see one thing in terms of something else. Schizophrenic people also, like children, have a shorter attention span. They see the world in grey and colours. They have very strong sensory domination. And they too have an underactive prefrontal cortex, as shown here. Here's a painting by a schizophrenic, a very famous one, which I think typifies the main issue. If you look at the cat on the top left, which is the first in the series at the beginning of someone's illness, as you can see, it looks like a perfectly recognizable cat. But gradually, as in psychiatric terms at least, there's a deterioration. I think in artistic terms, probably an improvement, artistically. No one would recognize this as a cat, let's be brutal, would they? So what you've done here is you've gone from cognitive to sensory. There's been a deconstruction back to the sensory, rather like I said, we built up when we saw our mother. Here we've got to retreat back to a purely sensory environment. What's that got to do with the other conditions? Well, anyone who eats knows the consequence of eating, but they eat nonetheless, because for people who are compulsive eaters, the taste, the sensation of the food trumps the consequences. And recklessness, anyone gambling knows the consequences of gambling, but it's the thrill of the roulette wheel, the roll of the dice, the horse going past, that I gather gives compulsive gamblers that real thrill that overrides the consequences of losing all your money. So what might have the gambling and eating and schizophrenia and children all have in common? All have an underactive prefrontal cortex. I'd suggest in all cases the senses trump the cognitive. The thrill of the moment, you might see where this is headed now, the thrill of the moment, the sensory, the literal, the excitement trumps the future or the meaning. So perhaps we'll have an increased recklessness with screen culture. Let's think about it. Arousal comes when you play computer games, addiction comes, and there's reward. Now, these conditions we all know in brain terms, have a common chemical root in terms of a chemical process that goes on in the brain. Not that this chemical has arousal or addiction or reward trapped inside it, but there is in the brain a chemical called dopamine, which is like a fountain in the brain and which has been related in ways we don't understand to being the final common path of all drugs of addiction, to underlie reward sensations and also to be underlying arousal or excitement. Now, could we therefore relate this to the prefrontal cortex? I think we could. Let's distinguish two basic states for the human brain: underfunctioning prefrontal cortex and the prefrontal activating. Here we have strong feelings and raw emotions as opposed to thinking, sensory versus cognitive, if you like. Here we have living in the here and now, living for the moment. Here we have the past, the present, the future, or a fantasy. Here the external environment is driving the flash of the lights or the colors, the strong domination of the senses will drive your moment of consciousness as opposed to an internal perception of the past or the future or something internalized that means something just to you. This has little meaning. This has therefore a lot of meaning. Here we have a reduced sense of self, an abrogation of the sense of self as we saw. Here we have a strong sense of self. Here there is no time and space, you're just there in the moment. Here you have a clear time-space reference. This can be linked to infants and children, this to older children and adults. Here I'm suggesting there is an excessive amount of dopamine, and with schizophrenia, for example, we know that that is caused by excessive dopamine or related to it. Here, less dopamine, and this I'm suggesting is linked to prefrontal underfunction. We know that the dopamine pathway, as I said, is like a fountain in the brain, and the only part of the outer brain, the cortex, that it targets, the only part is the prefrontal cortex, which it inhibits. So let's put this together. If we think about infantilizing the brain with the new technologies, I'd like to suggest this is what might be happening. We start off with intense stimulation of the screen, giving very fast responses. This is very arousing and very exciting, leading to high levels of dopamine release. This is associated with reward-seeking addictive behavior as more dopamine is released. This causes underfunctioning of that frontal prefrontal cortex, which then brings back or revisits conditions of schizophrenia, childhood, obesity, where the senses are dominating over the cognitive. We know that this area of the brain is a very cohesive area. When it's active, it pulls in all the other areas, but perhaps the brain now is more fragmented. The drive is for sensation over cognition. Therefore, the screen has a greater appeal than the much duller ordinary world, and therefore one will seek out more screen behavior. And that's what we're working on at the moment. That's just an idea of how neuroscience can try and provide an understanding of brain mechanisms leading to something that concerns us all today. But I'd like to suggest this nobody scenario is neither fulfilling nor individual. It's just, you're just there, you're yuck and wow, yucka wow, that's what you are. Anyone, fulfilled but not individual. Someone, individual but not fulfilled. Now, I don't want to leave you on such a gloom. I'm British, but I'm not gloomy, I hope. Yes? Even though our election is now probably... So let's think about this. Well, sometimes it's good to be someone, to fulfill yourself. Here's someone winning the Nobel Prize. It's a good thing to attain something. I remember I took 7 attempts to pass my driving test. And when I did, finally, I thought, I've never driven since, but I felt very proud of this. I hate driving. There's a bad thing to say here. To be nobody. Let's not, we all pay money to do this kind of thing. We enjoy letting ourselves go. And if you met someone who said, I never let myself go, I never have a sensational time, I don't think you'd want to spend much time with them, really, would you? Similarly, anyone, it's good to be part of a team sometime. It's good to work together. It's good to sublimate the individual in a team effort to achieve something as a collective. So these scenarios I've painted do have upsides as well as downsides. But I think there's also a fourth option. And this, for me, is the most exciting one, where we can think outside the box, if you like. This shows it's an idea. You know, this is scientists. It's about being creative, because being creative isn't just about painting a picture. You can be creative in the way you suddenly see a solution to rearranging your kitchen, or interpreting a complex social situation, or indeed in science, where you suddenly see a connection that no one else has seen. All these things can be called creativity. Now, for me, this is where the answer might lie, because when you're creative, you are being very fulfilled. We've all had moments where we felt that tingle and sudden insight, and often you're quite useful to society if you're doing something creative. So surely this is how those individual connections might be best served. How can we see to maximize them? Well, in childhood, we have growing connections, but children are often thought of as creative. In neurodegeneration, where people lose their connections, it's a frequent feature in dementia, where suddenly the patient will undergo a great burst of creativity they never exhibited when they were healthy. In dreaming, people often claim that's when they get their best ideas, when there's very weak connections because they're not driven by an outside stimulus. And in schizophrenia, many claim they are the rugged oracle, as it were, the schizophrenic patient, where there's dysfunctional connections due to excessive dopamine. So all these scenarios have been, well, people may claim that they are examples of creativity, yet all of them associated with fewer connections. And when people take drugs, where they impair the connections, some claim that they're being creative there. Now, what could be possibly in that? Well, if you look at a painting like this isn't recognizable completely as a person. Luckily, no one looks like this, I hope. But it's someone that's deconstructed again. They've deconstructed and challenged dogma to come up with an unusual take on people. And I think what one does when you are good in science, you challenge dogma. That's the first thing you do. You say, but why are you saying that? And why are we assuming that? So perhaps having a poverty of connections might be what it's about. Is it just having an underfunctioning prefrontal cortex, like those conditions we've just seen? Okay, this is Van Gogh. I have to tell you a story about Van Gogh. When I was at Oxford doing, well, I still am, but when I was doing medical admissions for medical students, and I posed the interesting question, if you were a psychiatrist and Van Gogh came and saw you today, how would you treat him? How would you treat him? What would you do? And the whole thing fell flat because no one had heard of Van Gogh, which is, I think, a bit sad. I know I'm sure you have, unlike the young generation there coming up. But the whole point is, not all ravers and people that take drugs are creative. And not all creative people are mentally ill or children. And so surely the issue is more that the fewer connections, for a variety of reasons, may be the first step. But then if they are the first step, they are necessary, they're not sufficient. This ability to be able to deconstruct something. So let's have a think about that. Well, this is a painting from Phoebe Collins, age 4 at the time, the daughter of a postdoc of mine, and she presented me with this sheep. Now, Phoebe has complied with not just one, but 2 criteria, in my view, of being creative. Step 1, she's deconstructed what sheep normally look like. Normally they're white with black legs. Here you see the sheep has now got a purple face, a magenta body, a turquoise tail. She's brought together unusual elements, and I think that is the second important step. But why isn't Phoebe's sheep, why isn't this painting acclaimed as a great work of art? Why isn't it seen as great creative? And yet this sheep is. This is Damien Hirst's sheep, of a pickled sheep in formalin, again. Why is that considered great art and the other one not? Well, let me suggest that what the Hirst sheep does, which Phoebe's sheep does not, is it makes you see life and animation in a different way. You may or may not like this work of art, but it makes you think, and it makes you see the world in a different way, compared to Phoebe's sheep, which I don't think makes you see the world in a different way. So perhaps that's the issue. Perhaps, first of all, we must deconstruct to abstract sensations, as we saw by disengaging the prefrontal cortex, but we must also have unusual and idiosyncratic or new associations, a new idea, new way of doing something, but that's not enough. And this is where the important thing is that distinguishes, in my view, real creativity from the others. These new associations must have more connections, activate a new meaning in the self and others. So you say, aha, eureka. Suddenly you're seeing the world in a different way than you did before. And when someone can make you do that, or help you do that, then they've given you something that's creative, in my view. So in order to be creative, you must have an identity. You must have a story to tell, otherwise things aren't going to mean anything. And you have to have a past and a future, and therefore you have to have a meaning. So in order to do that, this is a shameless plug for the book that is on sale here. In order to do that, I think we have to think very carefully about the environment that we are creating for our young people. These are the gloom scenarios I started with of blind belief, fundamentalism, robotic, devoid of emotions, or just a load of mushy emotions and no identity. No one wants that. But I don't think we have to have that. I think we could have other kinds of tomorrow's people, and these are my role models: Einstein, Shakespeare, Mozart. These people didn't just have better memories, they weren't computers. These people had only one thing in common, and that's that they were all different from each other. They were all highly original and creative and diverse. And I think it's by thinking of ways in which we harness the new technologies, these wonderful new technologies, harness the wonderful extra years that science and technology has given us, we now can anticipate a longer life than any other generation before. Biotechnology has freed us up to live longer and healthier lives. The physical sciences and technology have given us a life freed up from the drudgery that my mother and grandmother had. So now we have the most amazing thing of all. En masse, we have time, and with that time, we can become tomorrow's people, and let's hope the kind of people we are, and not people that just say yak and wow, but the people that are creative, fulfilled, and therefore of benefit to society. Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, so it's the first come, first served basis, obviously, up there. And we just go left, right, left, right. Okay, so are you going to chair it, yeah? You chair it. No one in the top wants to go there. Yeah, okay, so gentleman here.
Hello, thank you for your talk. And I wanted to ask, what do you do to care for your neurons? I mean, as we grow older, like you showed in the chart,
yeah.
we grow less connections. Is there anything that you're doing actually personally? Do you Sudoku or take vitamins, or how do you, what are you looking forward to extending your brain's life?
Okay, well, I'll talk from a personal point of view, which might not strike a chord with many, but it's often fascinated me why people play games, because there's so many more things to do in life than Sudoku, for example. You can learn a language or have an argument with someone or go for a walk. Yeah? So doing things that don't have an end or a meaning, for me, I find very strange. Yeah? But what I do is I love talking all the time. You probably noticed. Yeah? But it's a very nice, it's very good when people challenge you and you debate and you discuss, and I think that is one of the most stimulating. Another thing that I did when I was younger, I worked in France for a year, and I'd had 7 years of learning French at school and was terrible at it and spoke virtually nothing. Within 2 months after this complete saturation of French, where no one spoke to me in English, I could speak it, and you really feel your brain had gone to the gym. You know, I'd come home in the evening, and finally the day dawned when I wasn't so tired anymore. But that really, so learning another language is fantastic, and it's socially useful, and it's interesting, you know, rather than just doing the same old game or something. Actually doing something that, but above all, what I would suggest, in my case it's arguing and learning a language, but it has to be something you enjoy. There is no point, life is too short to do things that aren't fun and that you don't enjoy. Yeah. So you find out for yourself what you'd like to do. Gentleman here.
Thank you. As someone who had ADD, then I upgraded to ADHD, I'd like to ask the degree of human population and consumption, resource depletion, climate change, and species loss are or are likely to be unprecedented in human history. And yet the vast majority of us are either ignorant or in denial about how serious that these could become. How can these issues be understood by enough people for us to address them appropriately?
Okay, thank you for that. I think that's a really important question, and I think, in a sense, part of the answer is sitting in front of me now. The fact that you're all here, the fact that you've given up an otherwise nice evening in front of the telly or sitting in the bar or watching some football game, the fact you're here suggests you're here because you're interested in science and how science is related to society. And as you heard in Terry's very kind introduction to me, I think the way we get around these issues is to bring them back into the public domain again. You can't let the scientists be the conscience of the nation or of the world. Scientists are just ordinary folk. They're the same as everyone else. They just happen to know about one very specific small area that they happen to be researching on. They're not blessed with any greater insights or any greater morality or any greater strength of character or any judgment abilities than anyone else. And it's really important that all of us try and pull together to debate and discuss. And this can only be done if science is in the middle. And that can only be done, and that's why I'm very proud to be in the House of Lords, if you have science in politics, science in the media, science in the law. And I would say to younger people here who may not be considering a career in science, it doesn't mean you end up in a lab. Other sectors in society really need you if you've got some scientific training, because it's only if we infiltrate other sectors with people with a strong scientific background or scientific literacy can you start to address the issues you've raised. But above all, what you need is the whole public to own it again, to take it back. Don't think that because science has funny words and strange concepts, you'll never understand it. It is the duty of the scientists, and you pay them, you're the taxpayer. It is their duty to tell you what they're doing. It's their duty to explain to you in words that you can understand so that we can all discuss. And the concepts aren't hard, they're just dressed up in fancy words sometimes. But if you think about it, it's not hard, and we must engage and discuss, because you can't have a minority of people, least of all scientists, deciding our future. We all have to do it together, but it does mean that you have to come to evenings like this rather than sit in the pub. Gentleman up there.
First of all, let me make it clear, I'm not a believer in magic bullets. But throughout the evening, your talk kept alluding a word to me, a single word, which I thought it must be inevitable that you must utter, but you never did. And that word is dialogue.
Yeah.
And dialogue is a concept that essentially could unify much of what you say. When you show the picture of yourself with your colleagues, what is it that you share with them? It's a dialogue. And when you showed that wonderful picture of the interconnectivity of the units of the brain cells, aren't you really taking a picture of an active dialogue in the living brain? I'd like your views on that.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. It is indeed there's two levels of dialogue there. One is the dialogue of your own brain with the outside world, because it does become a two-way conversation in that you start off, as the Jesuit said, give me a child till he is 7 and I will give you the man. You start off unconditionally as a citizen of the world, just taking in whatever your culture is giving you because you've got no experience. But gradually, as you develop your connections, it becomes a dialogue because it's a conversation. The world influences your connections, and the connections will interpret the world for you. The other thing about the dialogue is I started off life actually doing Greek. And there, the whole emphasis is on always checks and balances. The Greeks would say on the one hand, on the other hand. And you always have, in Greek tragedy, two people, the agonist and the protagonist, always. Yeah. And so this notion of check and balance, of on the one hand, on the other hand, of the are but if so. And again, the Greeks found that the best way of developing an argument wasn't just one person sitting alone thinking, but rather always to have two people. And it's something I had the privilege at Oxford. We have the tutorial system, where you have the tutor and the student, where again you do that. And I think that you're dead right. I think dialogue is very important for getting as far as you can in terms of developing an idea. But again, then the final notion of dialogue is where one has dialogues in society where you talk all the time. And I think a healthy society is one where the general population lobbies and argues and questions and talks rather than just passively accepts. Yes. Thank you. Yes, yes, I.
So speaking of child until they're 7 and coming back to your NE1 model and the collective narrative, do you foresee a time in our future when we will see deep fundamentalist indoctrination as being either abusive or even illegal?
That's a hard one because we must never confuse. When I deliberately chose two political ideologies there because I didn't want it to conflate with people who hold deep religious beliefs. And for me, it's the ideology or the extreme rather than the thing that you're extreme about, whether it's religious or political. I think that making things illegal, although there are attempts, as with, say, taking drugs, or some people say to me, well, shall we restrict or ban our kids from using computer screens? I'm going to answer your question. My view is that, yes, that can be a way of combating something you find wrong or bad or unwelcome. But surely better than that is to show an alternative so the person themselves, rather than being legislated or regulated, is indeed educated. And my own view is that the best way forward, let's say with children on the screen, is not so much to ban them from using computers, that would be rather strange, but rather to show them experience or a way of fulfilling themselves that is an alternative. And the same with extreme ideological, the NE1 scenarios. I would like to think rather than making something illegal or punishing people, if you could allow people to lead fulfilling personal lives, to be creative, to have a nice home and an education for their kids and a fulfilling, exciting job, then there'd be less temptation to subsume under a collective narrative. In answer to your question very briefly, there's a brilliant book that was written in the 1930s by someone called Sebastian Haffner, and it's called Defying Hitler. He wasn't Jewish, but at the same time, he was very anti-Nazi, and he grew up between the wars in Berlin, and he actually documented, and it's very interesting to see from a German stance at that time, how they felt about the First World War and then the post-war period. And what he said was that Germany was so devastated at that time that what happened was they had to have a collective narrative because they had nothing on the personal level. They had nothing to live for, no personal possessions or material things. So initially, it was all to do with football. They would say, oh, Berlin has beaten Dusseldorf and so on. And that would become the way of talking, rather like during the war, it had been, have you heard about the battle here or the battle there? And the book argues that then when Hitler came along, he provided a still more compelling narrative for them that gave them a sense of identity, albeit a collective one. It's a really brilliant book. It's actually been a bestseller in Germany. What happened was the guy fled when Hitler came into power. He fled to the UK, died and left the book in his attic without knowing what the outcome of the war would be. Was only found a lot later by his son, was published by his son about 5 or 10 years ago. And so it's quite ironic to read the book, given the author didn't know what the outcome was going to be of what would happen. But so in answer to your question there, this is a rather rambling one because I'm thinking aloud, his idea was if you gave people enriched personal lives that were fulfilling, then they wouldn't be so victimized and they wouldn't buy into such extreme ideologies. And I think that's what we should try and do. I think we should try and help people, whatever it is, whether it's screens that we don't like or strong ideologies we don't like, to discover the joy of being individuals and of actually expressing themselves individually. Lady here.
How close is the international scientific community to finding a cure to Alzheimer's and Parkinson's disease?
Okay, thanks for that. First of all, I want to preface any remark I make with a huge caveat, which is that what I'm going to tell you is a neuroscientist's answer. I'm not a clinician, and whatever I tell you, please don't think that tomorrow you're going to be able to go into the drugstore and get the drug, and please don't think that it's going to be that easy and it's going to happen tomorrow. That's the bad news. The good news is that we're all on the case. There's a whole range of approaches and people around the world, as you might imagine, on the case, because this is the big problem as we confront an aging population. These are diseases of older people, therefore they're going to become more dominant, especially as TB and heart disease and cancer and so on are stabilized and dealt with and indeed in many cases cured. These other diseases are going to be unmasked because people won't die of those other things. So I think what I would say is not so much a cure, but let me give you an analogy. When I was much younger, in the middle of the last century, my mother used to refer to cancer as the C word. She wouldn't even say the word cancer in case she got it by saying the word. You know, it was so feared, it was such a spectre, no one would even dare articulate the word. You know? Now, of course, we know that it's still a very, very serious condition, but in many cases, people can be stabilized, they can recover, and so on. So we know a lot more about diagnosis, we know a lot more about treatments, and so on. And I think it's the same with neurodegeneration. It's not that overnight there's going to be a magic bullet, not overnight is someone like me going to come up and say, guess what, here's the cure. But I think what we're learning about are ways of preventing it possibly eventually, better sorts of diet, better kind of activities. We're learning or trying to develop better and earlier stages of diagnosis and more sophisticated drugs. Now, in that regard, let me just tell you of my own personal approach, but I do stress it's my personal approach. It's a lab-based approach. I'm not a clinician, and I'm not in phase 3 of clinical trials in a drug company. But what we're trying to do is a parallel approach involving 2 scenarios, scenario A and B. Each on their own would be great. Yeah? Scenario A is to develop a pre-symptomatic blood test. So the dream would be, and it's still a dream, that rather as you could go and get a cholesterol test now, and I'm sure everyone here does, I have them routinely, you get a blood test just to find what your cholesterol levels are with your GP, that you could, at over a certain age, or if you were worried, you could go and get a blood test. Now, if we could develop a marker that was already elevated before the symptoms came on, and we know in Parkinson's, for example, 80% of the cells have to go in the area before the symptoms present. Say you had a test that could detect 30%, then you could start people on medication early. Then, macabre that might sound, they could plan ahead at least with their lives. Everyone would know what was happening, yeah, with counselling. And above all, it would bring down the cost of clinical trials for developing better treatments. Yeah? So that on its own would be very helpful. Scenario B, which on its own people would bite their hands off for, is you go to the doctor with Parkinson's or Alzheimer's, and the doctor says, guess what? Now we have a way of stabilizing your condition. We're not going to be able to make you better. You've got movement problems still or cognitive problems still, but if you take a tablet every day, it's not going to get any worse. That would be fantastic. Now put those 2 things together. If both those scenarios came off, it would mean that you could go to the doctor, have a pre-symptomatic blood test. They said, look, you're not having any symptoms now, but you've got this elevated marker. That's the bad news. The good news, take the tablet every day. No more cells will die. The symptoms will never come on. Yeah? And that's what I'm trying to do. Now, and I do stress that it doesn't happen overnight. But
well, are you talking 10 years, 20 years?
Well, yeah. What we need to do is validate the basic mechanism. It's a bit like saying, you know, we've got the gun. We know how to shoot at people, but you need to know who the enemy is first. Until you know the enemy, you can't do it. Well, we think we are near to finding the enemy. And I do stress, we think we may be, yes? So that would be within the next year or so, we could validate that. And then in our case, I don't know, the blood tests don't take so long because you're not taking anything out of some, and you're not putting anything in. As you will be aware, to develop a drug is hugely expensive. I don't remember the telephone numbers of compounds where one gets through eventually, as we all know. So that is a good 15 years, even after you've got proof of concept. As far as I recall, there may be people who are in the drug industry who are gloomier. But I think that if something was discovered, it would be accelerated with a huge speed. You know? So my message to you is a mixed one. There's not a magic cure. There's nothing around the corner. But we are getting close, and with so many different people, that's my particular approach when I've just said other people are epidemiologists, others are toxicologists, some are cognitive psychologists, some are brain scanning experts, you know, others are molecular biologists, and all of us are trying in our different ways to combat this. And my own view is this is not like solving time travel or something like that. You know? It is possible to do. It will be possible to do as long as we have the resources. And I'd also say to governments, the amount of money that goes into other things, if they put more money into research into neurodegeneration, they'd be doing a great service. That's my plug. Thank you. Okay, I think we're up here now, up over the top now.
You were talking about computer games versus books and how we relate to the characters in the different mediums. And I was wondering where you think that movies, films fit into this.
Yeah, that's a really interesting one. Thank you. Some people say, and this could almost be a similar question, but what about televisions? You know, now how about television? I think it's the way you use technology. Because if you use a computer for a short period of time a day and you have an interesting life in 3 dimensions, yeah, then that would be analogous to the way my family grew up with the television. There was one television in our house. Everyone talked all the time, and it was a bit like the piano in Victorian times, you know, where you'd actually, it became part of the family culture, and you'd interact as a group, happening to have the telly on or like the piano on. And it could be that when you're watching movies together, you comment, you laugh, it's a good evening out, you go to the cinema together. That's one thing, but imagine a life where you just watched the movies or you lived for the movies and you didn't have anything else. Yeah? So it's not so much the medium or the thing itself, it's the extent to which it's used to the neglect of other things that you may do. Thanks. I think we're this side now.
So do you think that like text messaging or instant messaging on the computer can kind of inhibit like social skills later on in life or the development of your prefrontal cortex?
Okay, so they're 2 separate questions. I think that given what the human brain does is it gets good at whatever it rehearses, like we saw with the piano players. So if you're not rehearsing those other things, it'll be impossible to get good at them. Now, it may be that people who text and do social networking at the same time are writing letters or reading books or talking to people. That's fine, because you're rehearsing those things. But when it becomes that those more old-fashioned things are aversive because you're not used to them and you're not very good at them because you haven't practiced them, so therefore you retreat more into this other world, then I think it might be a problem. If indeed we want a society where people read and talk, and it may be, you know, I don't want to give value judgments, that we want a different type of society to, you know, marry with the certain technologies we have. So I'm not saying it's good or bad, but I will say that the best thing would be to have a portfolio, a whole range of activities, rather than doing just one thing is bad anyway, because you neglect other things, yeah? And it does sadden me when I see how people use words or how they use a shorthand, because then that means they kind of think in that shorthand, and that actually can blunt the way you may express yourself. In my view, the way you write and the way you think are often very closely related. Yeah?
Thank you.
Okay, I think it's the same. Yeah.
Thank you for being here. I am a user and proponent of entheogens, psychedelic drugs. And when I am on them, I realize that my prefrontal cortex doesn't function in a way that it normally would. At the same time, I believe that in normal states of consciousness, I, because of using psychedelics, can act as a catalyst for social change in my daily life. So I'm kind of just wondering if you have any views on that. And I think it also has to do with the idea of, you know, screen moderation, so to speak.
Okay, well, let me just preface that as I do when I talk to people about drugs, which is I'm not in holy orders, and I wouldn't set myself up in a judgmental way, saying what you should or shouldn't do. It's your body, it's your brain, it's your choice. Yeah? So that's my first statement. But what I can do is tell you how drugs work and what they do on the brain, so that when you do make your personal choice, you do so with an informed basis, an authoritative basis, rather than thinking you're inviolate. Yes? So basically, the way drugs work is to exaggerate or suppress the chemical messengers between one brain cell and another. And what can happen is, if this happens persistently, then you can induce longer-term changes in the brain. For example, the little chemical messengers always shake hands with something called a receptor on the target cell, and it's that handshake, that molecular handshake, that then induces the next signal along in the target cell. And whereas normally the chemical messenger is broken down because it's broken down by enzymes in the brain, an artificial substance such as a drug, which is acting as an imposter, will persist there. And the analogy I like to give is a bit like shaking hands and holding onto someone's hand so that hand becomes numb. And that's kind of what happens when a drug interacts with its receptor artificially. It so-called desensitizes the receptor, which means you need more of the agent now to have the same effect. And that is one of the bases of addiction. Now, if you know that, you can decide whether you want to do that in your brain or not. I'm not in any way interfering, that's your choice. But if you know it, it might help you make a decision or weigh up the pros and cons, bearing in mind that you are your brain, and blowing your mind might be exactly what you are doing when you do that. It's just a very important issue, and I think that I'm glad you flagged the issue about drugs, because increasingly people are turning to that. There's a big debate in the UK to decriminalise cannabis, which I'm against personally, because it's a little bit like the other question. My own thoughts are, it shouldn't be whether drugs kill you or not, because there's more to life than death, and it's more, are you not reaching your full potential if you do that? And surely we are sending people down the river if we just make it easy for them to escape from something they don't like or is hard. Wouldn't it be better to provide an alternative where people are more fulfilled and having exciting lives rather than trying to escape from them? So it's for you to decide. All I can tell you is that psychedelic drugs are very potent, very strong agents. You may be changing your brain in a way that you hadn't anticipated or wanted, and that you might just consider alternatives if indeed you are not happy with how you are. If you are happy with how you are, as long as you're not hurting other people, then it's not for me to judge you. But just think about what's happening. The fact you're here this evening suggests that you are perhaps interested in how drugs work on the brain.
Thank you.
One more, okay. So one more round. So I think where are we? Left or top? Top, okay, top, yeah.
Do you think tomorrow's people could look to the people of yesterday, of ancient India, who used herbs that weren't necessarily drugs, but some of the chemicals in the herbs were nootropics, which would release more oxygen to the brain, and then therefore in Ayurvedic culture they actually consider it a way to combat Alzheimer's and certain homeopathics like that.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting, and I think you're raising two issues there. One is taking drugs to enhance yourself, and when we were at the high school today, we were talking about transhumanism, which someone described as the world's most dangerous idea, which is taking cognitive enhancers or agents or a technological route to make your mental or physical powers better. The problem with any drug, is there are always side effects. There is no drug that will not have side effects in your brain, because they will target the chemicals in the brain, and the chemicals in the brain are all over your brain. They're not just in one place. A simple example, if you take L-DOPA for Parkinson's disease, you will run the risk of enhanced psychosis, because that's the excess of dopamine somewhere else in the brain. Or similarly, if you take a dopamine blocker, a major tranquilizer so-called for schizophrenia, then you will induce possible risk of having Parkinsonian side effects, because you're manipulating the two. So on the one hand, I wouldn't promote or myself recommend cognitive enhancers, but you do raise a very interesting question about enhancing oxygen and that combating Alzheimer's. Right. And there's some very interesting work done here by Rusty Gage in the States. It's called Rusty Gage, and he has shown that there's a much better way of getting oxygen into the brain, and that's with physical exercise. And he's shown that both in rats and humans, that people that take a lot of exercise can induce something called neurogenesis, which is neuronal growth. He's called Gage, if you want to look him up. So I think you're right to flag this with oxygen, but not right that route.
It's just kind of like opposites, whereas our culture will take Ritalin and stare at a screen, as theirs, they'll have this herb that they take in a spiritual way and then meditate on metaphorical types of ideas, kind of.
Well, meditation, of course, is another issue altogether that doesn't have to be completely tied in with the taking of drugs. Certainly when I've been in India, I've been impressed by the sophistication of the audience and the number of people that meditate to talk about that when I've given talks on consciousness. And they asked me one thing, and I personally don't do it, and they said, don't British people meditate? And they looked horrified that this wasn't the norm, and of course no one does over there. You know, so it's a very different attitude, I agree, in Eastern cultures, in embracing a more spiritual dimension that's not material. But I think that's a separate issue from inducing excess oxygen into the brain, which is good, but Rusty Gage work shows that that actually can be achieved with exercise, which has to be good all round. Okay, go ahead.
A few years ago, I listened on the radio that I don't know who it was, but he said that video games, they stimulate the mind and basically give you an enhanced ability to make quick decisions and better one and with a little bit of wisdom. But what I see through my friends and other people is frustration and anger is aroused when they fail to complete the objective of the game. And what I hear most by my parents is video games and television rots your brains out.
Yeah, okay.
So I want an opinion on which is true and which is, yeah.
Okay. Well, actually, both can be true in what you've said, in that it's one thing to be able to make quick decisions, to improve your sensory motor coordination, to see patterns, to solve a problem quickly in the abstract. As I've said, that's why IQ levels may be being increased. But by the same token, the emotional accompaniment of the significance or lack of the significance when you have a certain outcome, that is not catered for by just improving mental agility. The maturity to cope with emotions and certain outcomes comes by having a conceptual framework, which does not come from just rehearsing one type of thing. So in a sense, both things are right. And I think what you must always do is try and see the significance in what is happening. And what I do find very sad, and something that worries me hugely, is the increase in violence and violent games. It's almost as if because you're only having your vision and your hearing stimulated, the other sensations which are neglected, such as touch and smell, because they're under-neglected, you have to raise the game with the two modalities that you're using. So they have to be more strident, more bright, more fast. And rather a bit like the sensitization of the receptors, the more you see, the more desensitized you become, so the more extreme what you need. What also frightens me is the blurring of reality with the cyber world, and that some people, perhaps very young people, start to confuse the two. And in England, there was a horrible case recently of two 11-year-olds who almost killed two other 11-year-old children. And as if that wasn't bad enough, they were videoing it on their phone saying, oh, we've got some really good pictures now. Yeah? And then putting them on YouTube. Well, you know, you hear cases like this. And I think that that does belie that they do not understand pain and red stuff coming out of people. And I heard a little 7-year-old girl from a middle-class family who the other day kicked a cat. Yeah? And I think it's because, not that these are violent people, really, it's just they do not understand the difference between Tom and Jerry and the real world if you have a constant anchoring in that other world. And that's what I fear very much. One more question, yeah.
I'm a high school teacher, and my question is, what kind of changes will schools need to make in order to effectively aid in the development of tomorrow's students?
Thank you. I think there's several things. I think nowadays, and I'm not an educationalist, so you'll probably know, is that kids are having a lot of pressure to compete, to be better than each other, to get scores. And I think what would be wonderful if we could think of a way in which, I used to say to this to the kids at Oxford that I used to teach, who were obviously very competitive, and they'd been the stars at their school, and they came to this very good university, and of course they discovered they weren't the stars anymore, you know. And the great crisis always with those first-year students was that they weren't, you know, their tutorial partner was better than them, or they weren't as good. Yeah? And I said to them, this is what I would say to you, and this I think is an important lesson for kids perhaps to take, in my own view, is that there will always be people cleverer than you. There'll always be people stupider than you. There'll always be people richer than you, or poorer than you, or fatter than you, or thinner than you. Yeah? There'll always be someone, you know, who is more whatever or less whatever than you are. So why beat up on yourself, and why worry about trying to do things to beat the other person? And I used to say to my students, you've got one rival only, and that rival is yourself last week. Yeah? It's yourself last week. And if you can, You know when you're stretching yourself. You know when you've really tried. You know when you've just winged it. That's what you have to work on, not so much that you've got better score than someone else. You know, and then you'll discover within your portfolio of talents things that you're terrible at. For example, I don't cook anymore because I'm bad at it. I've just given up on that one. So it's much easier not to even try, you know. And you concentrate on the things you do like doing, like writing books, yeah. So for me, a weekend writing a book is more enjoyable than a weekend cooking. Other people would find it like work that I was doing, would enjoy cooking. Yeah, that's fine. You know, we all do what we enjoy doing, and we're all special and better, and we forget and don't fret about the things we're not good at doing. And I think if we could encourage the citizens of this century now, not so much be good at just one thing, like having a good memory or passing a test, but actually discovering in themselves and having people like yourself help them develop their particular portfolio of talents, so that they feel really fulfilled and happy and satisfied in what they're doing. That would be the main thing if we could do that, rather than just producing a lot of little robots. You know? Okay.
Let's go off because we...
Okay. I'll go off, yeah?